I've gone ahead and added a couple of cameras to the scene at different altitudes. And you can load in the scene infinite terrain _03 to get these additional cameras. If we switch through, I have sort of a mid-level altitude, which is just around this area of the scene. And then low altitude, which is in front of that, a little bit further, and then down on the ground, or close to the ground. You can go ahead and set that to, say, 3 meters to make it a little bit closer. And then a high altitude camera, which is 2 kilometers in the air, or 2 kilometers above the terrain. If you go to the numerics tab, and then the position, which is the first option, the Z is going to show us our actual height, 2.8 kilometers. So the terrain underneath us right now is 812 meters high. So let's go over to the main camera. I also went ahead and changed the render size to Academy Standard Flat to open it up a little bit more. You can see a bit more of the scene. And what we're going to do now is start customizing the sky. Go ahead and F4 on the keyboard to open the atmosphere editor. And the first thing I'm going to do is take the glow intensity and bring it down to 2% and bring the scattering to 0.7. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is create a sunrise. So what I'm going to do is select the sunlight, and with it pointed at the camera, move it down closer to the horizon. We can also go to the Sun tab and set a value there. And now if we go too low, and it doesn't look like the atmosphere editing is updating, so if I close it and open it again, we can see we're at 0.5 degrees. Right now, I believe we're in the haze. So if we take down the haze to 0, we're going to see the sun within the decay area and still having the density of the atmosphere from the sky ground density. So depending on the height of the haze and the density, you will lose the sun if you're too low. So that's just one adjustment. Right now there is no fog and no haze. The glow is also impacted by that and how much the light is spreading out. We lost most of that glow effect once the haze was removed. Now because we have a sunrise, we're not going to have as much light coming from the sun. So what we're going to do is go to the Light tab and change the light intensity down to -2. It's going to darken things up. If the sky doesn't refresh in the OpenGL, you can go to Refresh Sky. From that first menu there, the View Display Options. Also, if you go to File and Options, under Display Options, there is a couple of options for OpenGL Atmosphere Previews. And what I want to do, there's an overall value. You can turn on the Atmosphere Preview, turn it off, and once we start adding clouds, we can turn on Preview Clouds, and that'll preview clouds that are above the camera. Anything below the camera won't show up. Depending on if you're using the Shader 4 model within the graphics settings, file options, OpenGL, the 2.1 Shader 4, or the fixed hardware pipeline, you're going to get different results. For a look at the OpenGL and different options, whenever you're using Shader 4, the Show Fog and View Density from Atmosphere and Adjust Fog Density are all grayed out. And that's because it's just done automatically and it's included in it. We do have the ability to turn the shadows on and off, and then adjust light from the scene, whether or not we want to show the lighting. Now, I'm going to go ahead, and I already did this, right-click on the preview and just turn on the auto update. That way, anytime I make a change, it will automatically update this render. I usually keep the auto update off because it can slow your system down when you're making a lot of changes and you're not really using the camera preview. So just keeping that off right now. If I go back to the sunlight, I'm going to drop it down a bit more. I'm going to go to the Sun tab, and because I'm using a spherical scene, what I can do is actually go below the horizon, or below what would be the horizon if I wasn't using a spherical scene, because the horizon line will drop as the camera goes up higher, and we can start to see the sun showing, even though we're 1 degree below. We can go down to -3 degrees and just start that early morning rise of the sun. Maybe bring back a little bit of the haze if it doesn't darken too much. Now, already in the preview, with the haze coming on, the subtraction from that is creating a bit of grain. Now this is just in the preview, so we really want to go ahead and take a look at a render to see how that's going to look in the final output. And it's already starting to look grainy. So if you have extremes, in this case the subtraction from the haze color to the rest of the scene, it's starting to cause a bit of grain. If I go ahead and zoom in along the sky area, one thing I can do is, because this is pretty dark overall, I'm just going to show that last render using the 3-color bar up at the top to pull that open. And what we can do is raise the exposure. I do need to go into the post-render options to do that and have it show up and affect this. And we can see the grain a bit more this way. Of course, the sky is very bright now. Everything is very dark overall. I'm going to go ahead and decrease the haze. And even then we might have a little bit of a grain showing up. So that's primarily caused by the dark and light influence. So getting a balance of that, we really need to go through and adjust the decay color, or the decay mean altitude, sky altitude, in order to get something that's more balanced, depending on the look you're going for. Sometimes the only way to get rid of that grain, really depending on the scene, is to adjust that quality boost. If we bring it up to 1 and now render it out, it's going to be decreased. So the more we raise that quality boost, the better it's going to end up looking. It will smooth it out. I do know that in order to remove grain completely in almost all situations, the quality boost needs to be set to 32, which is really high and takes a long time to render. I do know that that value will not produce grain. With a lot of testing, I found that out. Also, using that with the advanced effects quality, making changes to the overall volumetric quality, and since the atmosphere is a volumetric, that was determined after pretty much setting the advanced quality all the way up and then adjusting the quality boost in a ton of different situations. If we go ahead and bring it up to 4 and take a look, it's rendering fairly quickly, and that's because there's really no clouds. But the grain is almost completely gone now, and it looks pretty good. And overall, that will work. Lower amounts just to the point where things balance out, at least for stills anyway. If we bring it up higher, bring it up to 8, I just want to make sure that it'll stick, and it does look like we are able to go over the max amount. Some quality boosts won't let you go over, and in version 8 I was able to go over. Just want to make sure there were no changes in version 9 to that. So now we can see it smoothing out even more. Now, if we have clouds in the scene, it's going to take them a little bit longer to render. But whenever we have these harsh contrasts, the only way to really get rid of the grain is to increase that quality boost or the advanced effects quality. I'm going to go ahead and set it to 0. Grain's going to come back a bit. And now we can adjust some of these other settings. So the decay is basically the subtraction of the sky light, the amount of light that we have throughout the altitude. Now, the mean altitude is really about half of the actual lit part of the sky. If you want to keep everything completely realistic, then your sky mean altitude typically wouldn't rise above 6 kilometers. Depending on the units of the scene. I mean, you can obviously create whatever you want. But looking at the grain and the balances, in this case, because we have the sunlight below, then the preset values for quality might not apply. But I also do have the light intensity turned down really low, so that could have something to do with it. At the horizon of the planet of Earth, we have the troposphere ending around, I believe, 14 kilometers. So going above 7 kilometers would extend beyond that. I believe it goes all the way down to 8 kilometers at the poles, which would be a value of around 4 kilometers for the mean. So right now our decay is also going above. So if we can lower that, let's go ahead and set that to 5 kilometers for the decay altitude. Increase that up to 100%. And that way we don't have that really sharp over-contrasted line that was red before. And that was caused because the difference was so high. I'm going to go ahead and bring the haze altitude to 3 kilometers. And let's do 15% for the density. And take a look at just a quick render of that. A little bit larger, a little clearer. And once again, the exposure has a lot to do with the grain, because with the auto exposure at 0, the grain doesn't appear very high. Once we turn that up, you can see it a little bit better. Natural film response too, we can also see is balancing out the different color areas. So where we have what would normally be black, and it looks like some tearing in the terrain, it does balance out. So not always, you don't always want to have the natural film response on, especially when you're dealing with darker scenes, darker contrasts. It can sometimes make things look undesirable. So as far as modifying colors, now these values I have for the sky and decay are basically or close enough to the default. They are a little bit off because if I was to right click and click reset, which you can do to any of these colors to reset them to their default state, the RGB values would be 83 for red, 144 for green, and then 233 for the blue. So a little bit different for the sky than what I currently have. Well, let's just go ahead and reset these colors right now. And we're not going to see much of a change because it was a very minimal amount of difference. I'm going to go ahead and set my sky mean altitude to 6 kilometers. Things are getting a little bit darker. And now what I want to do is have the sun, let's go ahead and make it a little bit bigger. So let's go to the sun tab. We're going to make that sun larger. And we can just start to see it pop up over the horizon. Make it really big. Also increase the size of the corona. Give us a really nice glow. And just kind of adjust these values. We've lost pretty much all lighting on the terrain itself. So we can reduce the corona size. And we're seeing that start to bend and refract a bit within the atmosphere. Let's go ahead and set this to negative 1.5. Really increase the amount of lighting because now we're rising up a little bit over the horizon because of our height. So let's do negative 2. It looks a lot better. Okay, so depending on the position of the sun in relation to decay amounts, the color has changed a lot. Also because of the overall light intensity. So if we need to, we can increase the decay height and darken it up. Or what we can do, if we bring that back to 5 kilometers, is decrease the sky mean altitude. So if we raise that or lower it to 4 kilometers, we're going to start to get more of that orange hue back. We can bring that down to 3 kilometers and darken it up even more. Now if we adjust the glow intensity, we can really get that red to come out. Maybe set the sky to 4 kilometers. That's not looking too bad. Go ahead and take this haze and set it to 1.5 kilometers. Because we can't adjust the aerial perspective, what we can do is decrease the sky density. And once the sky density is almost gone, we're really seeing more of the decay and the haze together. So we can get really interesting looking skies that way. Let's go ahead and set our haze to 500 meters. And we'll drop it down just a little bit. And I don't have any fog still. I'm going to take down the glow intensity, which doesn't really have too much of an effect right now because we don't have much haze. Increase our haze 50%. Maybe bring it up to 1 kilometer in height. And we're just not seeing a whole lot right now because the sun is so low in the sky. Let's do glow intensity 25. And a cool thing we can do is actually raise up the densities of these other settings. So now I've got the decay amount at 500%. We can see a very dark red glow. Some interesting things you can do. We can also raise the sky density to see even more showing up. And because we just don't have the aerial perspective adjustment when we're working with a spherical scene, it's really the only way to adjust the aerial perspective is just by adjusting that sky ground density and making it higher. For the most part, it does react about the same way, even though the aerial perspective is almost an overall increase in all of the different densities. Depending on the scene you're working with, you might need to adjust them, or all of them. Let's take a look at some of the shadow options. Now that we have the sun as low as it is, what we're going to do is add a cloud layer. Let's go ahead and use the dark cumulus layer. And right now they're pretty low. If you're seeing a lot of little peaks shooting up, which I can see right now, that's caused by the altitude variations. So if you ever see what looks like almost sharp little cones or peaks coming off the top of any cloud layer, that's caused by the altitude variation. So I'm going to bring that down to 3%. And a lot of those should go away. And it looks like the lighting is a little messed up within the Opengl. Let's go ahead and grab this cloud layer, and now we'll start to see those showing up in the OpenGL. Some pretty dark clouds, are pretty washed out anyway. Now one thing you're going to notice, as we bring these up a little bit further, for the most part they're really washed out from the ambient lighting. If you did want some dark clouds, you will need to go to the Light tab and decrease the ambient light color in order to make those really dark, if that's what you're looking for. Because unfortunately the only way to really make a dark cloud is to adjust the ambient light color. There doesn't really seem to be any other way to get that good contrast without making severe changes to everything else in the scene. If we reset the color, basically the ambient light, even if we turn off ambient lighting on the clouds, if we edit the material for the cloud, go to lighting and effects, there's a force ambient light color, there's also the GI ambient lighting. Making changes to those, we can have a very small effect, changing the actual color of the cloud, but for the most part, you really need to just adjust the ambient light. Even really high densities will wash that out. So one change that was actually made in the jump between view 8 and view 9 is the density amounts have been ramped up a lot, or actually decreased through the slider area. The density is 800 and over 800%. This dark cumulus, I believe, used to be about like 200%. Full slider. So now, if I bring this down to 100%, we're going to start to see a little more detail in the clouds. So the density before was really difficult when you wanted just really, really light clouds. You didn't want to have them dense at all. It was kind of difficult to control that. You had to use values in 0.05, things like that, in order to actually get a low density. So the amount of area density that we have within the control is now diminished compared to the way it used to be. Just in case you're migrating from a different version. And what we can do is increase the sharpness a little bit, add a little bit of ambient light, and I'm going to raise up the sun to 3 degrees. Actually, no, we'll go ahead and do 1 degree, because I do want to show the way the shadows will react. So we'll get that adjustment here, go to the main camera and adjust the exposure. We can bring that down to 0 now. Now what I wanted to show you, if we go to the Atmosphere Editor, Sky Fog, and Haze tab, I just turned it to no shadows on clouds on. It was set to projected shadows. When you have the sunlight lower than the horizon, which I'm going to do now, just want to get those clouds lit up a bit. And it looks like pretty even lighting throughout. The sun looks like it's influencing it. If we set it to projected shadows on clouds, we should be able to see the shadow from the terrain, which would be the horizon point. If not, I might need to switch over to a planetary terrain to cover that more. And that way the terrain itself can cast shadows onto the clouds. Otherwise, no shadows are going to be on the clouds whatsoever, except just self-shadowing. So if you go to File and Options, we're going to turn on the Use Planetary Terrains. Click OK. And see if we can get any impact there. Just mostly looking for the shadow cutoff for the clouds, because it is pretty interesting, but I guess it only appears in certain situations. Maybe our terrain just isn't high enough. I'll see if I can go ahead and set something up a little bit later for that specific look. I am going to go ahead to the haze, bring down to 15%, which might have been removing some of that color. And if we take a look at the sun tab, we can see we are still negative. Let's go ahead and take a look at a quick render. And it doesn't look like there's all that much detail right now. What I'm going to do is take the intensity of the sun, go back to 0, in order to get some more light on the clouds. Also, I noticed I do have the opacity value turned down really low. So let's go ahead and turn that up a bit. And right now everything is looking a little blue. Let's go ahead and take our haze, bring it up to 4 kilometers. Sky mean altitude to 5.3 kilometers. And really quick, something just showed up, a very dark looking scene. And it is the other way to really kind of get a darker cloud, although it will also adjust just everything in the scene, the overall sky color. And that is to remove the altitude of the cloud, or of the sky. That's going to make everything really dark and just give us, in this case, because the sky mean altitude is at 0, all we're seeing is the decay and the haze. But it looks really neat. If we take a look, we can see just a really nice overall orange color with dark clouds, if you want to have a dark cloud. But we could also increase the ambient lighting, and lightening clouds is a lot easier than it is to darken them. But taking a look, it's pretty interesting looking, although we would probably have to add a little fog or haze to make up for the loss of density within the atmosphere, because right now we can see the clouds out very far, and we would have a lot more fall off there normally. But that is a neat little way to get some very high contrast looking scenes. If we go ahead and increase that haze amount, we can wash it out a little bit more, balance the color, maybe raise it up a bit, might darken it a little too much. But that does work for a stormy type sky. We could start to bring in the altitude and decrease the density a little of the sky. And that looks pretty neat overall. For kind of an overall glow of everything, we would have to increase the brightness of things in order to get a little more light out of that. So going over to this light tab, increasing the light intensity, then the sky is going to glow a lot more, and we're going to be able to see the ground a little bit better in order to balance with the fact that our sun is below the horizon. And that's a fairly interesting looking sky. Let's go ahead and bring back the ground density of the sky. And because I have the haze up so high, even though I brought back the sky density, there's basically no sky showing. So what we're seeing is basically the haze effect. And now as we start to decrease the haze, we're going to see the clouds balance out, and we're also going to see the sky showing up a little bit more. So you can really see how everything is just very dependent on each other. There are a lot of variables back and forth. Now let's say we want to go with this scene, but we don't want the ground to look that light. We want to darken it up. If we take a look at the overall sky color, it's not quite black. So what we might need to do is adjust the sky dome lighting gain, say -1, and we should be able to darken the terrain. So now it's almost black. So we might want to not quite go that far, but the sky dome lighting gain is a nice way to just balance out the rest of the scene, other than the atmosphere, when you have an atmosphere that you want, but the lighting on the rest of the scene or the terrains and ecosystems doesn't quite look right. Now that took a little while to refresh, because what it did was render the atmosphere Opengl clouds first before it would trigger the render in the main camera preview. So if you need to turn off the Opengl clouds, you can get a faster render or update within the preview. So now I've switched over to the mid camera, the mid altitude. We can see a little bit more going on with different color changes with the current look. Let's go ahead and switch over to the low camera. And because the low camera is right on top of the terrain, and the sun is below the horizon, and we are working with planetary terrain, all light is being blocked. There's really nothing showing. So the altitude does have a big impact. If we go over to the high altitude, now the glow is so high, we really don't see anything else within the scene. Take a look at the exposure, and we'd really need to brighten it up a very large amount in order to balance it. So then we would need to, in this case, if you're rendering up this high, go over to the lighting and probably decrease the brightness. Maybe get rid of that sky dome lighting gain decrease. And if we have to make small changes to maybe some of the other parts of the scene, it does look like the clouds are now starting to show. So what we can do is increase that sky dome lighting gain in order to start to see the cloud showing up, but still have something that's immensely dark, and it does look interesting that way. More of a unique looking sky. So now let's take a look. What I'm going to do is take the sun, raise it up a bit. I did turn the point at camera off as I was switching through the other cameras. I'm just going to raise that up in the sky. I want to show you what we can do for high altitude renders to get some nice colors showing. What I want to do is take the sky mean altitude, and let's set it to 4.5 kilometers, and take the decay amount, and we're going to set that to 2 kilometers. Our haze, we'll go ahead and do 1 kilometer at 25%. And let's get that to refresh. Before I do anything, I'm actually going to go ahead and just turn off the clouds for now, because they're taking a little bit longer to refresh, and I really want to get a sense of the sky color first, and then I can worry about the clouds later. So what I want to do is go to the sun, and let's go ahead and bring it up to around, let's just type in 18 degrees, because I did want to lift it up a little bit more. And I'm going to go to the sun size and bring it down. The corona and bring it down. Maybe bring that haze up to 2 kilometers. Let's do 30% for the density. and then bring our scattering to 0.8, glow to 3. Setting the glow to a lower amount helps give us a darker color sky because we have less brightness on the light spreading out. So now what we can do to make the sky a little bit darker is decrease the density of the sky. That's going to balance things out a little bit more. We could also go to the light tab and make things a little bit darker that way. But if we want a deep blue showing up, because this is kind of washed out, it does look pretty nice. Overall balance. I'll go ahead and render that really quick. So that's a pretty nice balance overall between all of the different shadows and the haze and everything. It doesn't look too bad. But what I want to do is go over to Sky Fog and Haze, and if we increase the density a lot, we could also adjust the exposure to compensate, which view should do automatically. But then we have way too bright of horizon because of the haze, and without having to go through and really edit and modify too much, what I want to do is go to the sky color, just right click, edit the color, and I'm going to make it a much deeper blue. And now we have something that works a lot better, and this creates a really great high altitude just by darkening that blue. So I'm going to go ahead and lift up the camera so we can see more of the sky. And that doesn't look too bad overall. Changes to the sky color can really have a drastic effect if you go too far in one direction. In other words, if we bring it a little bit too blue, it's going to start to look more purple. Same thing with the other way. It would start to go towards the green side, just because there's so many other things modifying it. A cool thing we can do, let's go to the haze color and edit that, and start to raise up towards a specific direction, or towards a certain color. So we have 127 on the RGB right now. What I want to do is raise up which color influence I want to have more of along the horizon. And just starting pretty small, let's go ahead and use the green and type in 135. And we should notice a little more of a green tint. It's really pretty subtle. Let's go ahead and bring this up to 3 kilometers. And then go back. Maybe set to 200 just so we can have something more intense at first. A very interesting green haze, because that was probably a bit too much. So we can either bring in a little more blue, or what's probably better in order to keep our tones the same is just to reduce that green amount, or maybe introduce another color. But since the blue is kind of the main thing we have right now, if we start adding too much blue, it's going to remove a lot of the variation. So if we brought the blue up, let's say 160, we are either not going to see a change, or looks like it's happening right there. We're having a huge subtraction within the color, and everything just gets really bland in a certain area where it stays a solid color. So if the haze is too close to the sky color, that can happen. So sometimes what you can do is start minimizing that blue output in the RGB. Overall, that doesn't look too bad because it's not very extreme. We don't have a very high haze amount. Go ahead and bring it down to 25. Then we're going to get more of a yellowish green look. kind of neat looking. We could also bring it over. Let's go 127, 127, and bring the red up to 165. And do more of a purple, pink type haze. So just really adjusting everything towards the horizon. And take our decay amount down a little bit. And get more blue showing up in the sky. And if we want to darken the sky even further, we can go into the sky color, darken it up. But once we go too far, we're going to lose a lot of the saturation values. So if you don't want to have it too dark and you still want to have some of the nice brightness in there, you can increase the haze, but since we have a color with the haze now, we might get it too pink. So the balance is sometimes better changed with the skyground density amount going a little bit over and balancing it. And let's go ahead and take a look at how it looks with the clouds. Now this is still rendering out, but we can already see that the clouds are extremely bright. Now this is because the clouds are above some of the subtracting atmospherics in their altitudes and their mean altitudes. So there's a couple of different ways. Obviously, lowering the clouds and their altitude would be the best thing to do. But if you can't do that because you've got them where you want them, you got your terrain where it's at, and everything looks good that way, what you can do is go right-click, edit the material for the cloud, go to color and density, take that volumetric color and knock it down a bit, and that will darken the diffuse area of the cloud. So now we can already see in the preview that they're a lot darker, at least in the areas that are being lit by the sun, and just in order to balance things out. Obviously it's more unrealistic that way, but often realism is hard to photograph when you have extremely bright objects and darker objects, and you want to create a balance. So sometimes we just have to knock down the color of the cloud a little bit in order to get that to show up correctly. So now with the finished rendering, you can see it's a lot darker, not so overexposed as it was before. So now if we were to increase the exposure of the frame, it would be a balanced overexposure. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over to the mid camera. And overall, everything looks balanced pretty well for the color. Let's go to the main camera. And it looks like we might just need an adjustment on the shadow density. So if the shadows are too dark, we do have the option to lower the shadow density, but also we could maybe increase the lighting. That is going to wash out the sky a bit into a color that we might not want. Because we do have that density up really high. And before, things were kind of set for a high altitude, or faking a high altitude for the most part. So we can bring that back down to 100. Things are going to start to get a little more purple. It does balance a little bit more. So we can make further changes if needed. There's a lot of different ways to make these adjustments. Decreasing that scattering in order to increase the scattering amount. Looks a little bit better. for that area. Also keep in mind that we do have a very low focal length on the camera, so we're seeing a very large amount of the scene. If we go over to the main camera and we set it to, let's say, 22, we're going to see things more than we see if we had one eye fixed on an area. Having it lower around 12 or 13 is basically having an entire field of view for a scene that you would be able to kind of pan across. It's more of a panoramic type focal length. So color balances and everything, it will change a lot, and also grain settings too. Now the lower your focal length is, the more chance you're going to have of seeing grain, because you're seeing so much more of the scene and so many more changes between the different lighting intensities. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Much different looking sky from 22 millimeters than it is from 12. Where that glow is really not seen as much. So a good idea to really have your focal length set and your camera set up before you're going in and making major changes to the sky, because if you end up zooming in to something, it could completely change the look of the entire scene in the atmospherics. So I'm going to go ahead and save this version as number 5. And then next what we're going to take a look at is the clouds. Customizing clouds, modifying them, making them render faster and look a little bit better, and different things we can do with them. The cloud system is really very powerful. And because they do take a little bit longer to render, in order to be able to show as many examples as possible, I'm going to be using a different scene and setting something else up for it.